Right, we're going to catch up on the last part of the histology that we got to look at, right? We already went over epithelial sheets. That was that kind of sheet of cells, right? That was forming that barrier or lining things, right? Kind of like what we talked about today. And then for the connective tissue, it was the stuff that was connecting things together, right? It was packaging different types of tissues together. It was kind of organizing the material, right? And so far, the connective tissue proper we looked at, right? It was kind of a squishy, pliable material, right? To kind of get a sense of that, you just pinch yourself, and then you can kind of squish your skin around, you can move it around and stuff, right? Most of what you're feeling there is connective tissue, right? That fibrous connective tissue, right? What you're really feeling is that mostly the dense connective tissue of your dermis. And then closer to the actual cells, you'll have that loose connective tissue, much more delicate, right? A lot of ground substance for diffusion. Whereas this was, this is what leather is basically, like that dense, irregular connective tissue, if you treat it and all that. But again, if you want to get a sense of what that is, you just, give your skin a little pinch there, right? As far as the material that your body's made out of. So for this other type of connective tissue, these specialized ones, bone and cartilage, here we're going to have like a solid structure right over here, right? It's going to be solid, and it's all going to be due, again, because of the matrix, right? Instead of fibrous connective tissue, we're going to have either a mineralized matrix of bone or like a hard rubber of cartilage, kind of, right? So we're going to have things that are going to give us structure, give shape and support. Right? And as far as the difference between bone and cartilage, it's going to be like bone is a very incompressible material, kind of more like metal relatively, whereas cartilage is going to be semi-compressible, but mostly it's going to be resist compression, but it's going to give a little bit, right? More like hard rubber, right? As far as the material we're made out of. Bone is easy to feel on yourself. You can feel your elbow or your arm or anything. You can actually feel your bone. You know what that feels like. Cartilage, you can get a little bit of sense of in some areas of your body, right? Your ears and your nose and stuff have cartilage in them, right? So we're just going to go over briefly a little bit about the structure of those materials and the cells and stuff within them, right? So you had fibroblasts in the connective tissue proper. The fibroblasts there were making the matrix within bone and cartilage. You have a couple more types, but your main kind of mature cell in bone are called osteocytes. When you see the word osteo, right, you got to think bone, right? Because bone is actually osseous tissue. Right? So if you see the word osteo, it has something to do with bones. Maybe it's osteocyte, maybe it's an osteoblast, right? Whereas chondro is going to refer to cartilage. Chondrocyte, chondroblast, right? These are going to be those cells that are within the cartilage, right? And these two share a closer developmental origin than, say, fibroblasts, although they're all related. And they also have this shared characteristic. They're sitting in this little lake, this little lacuna, because the matrix around them isn't very hospitable for this soft, delicate cell right here. It's going to be sitting in this little tiny bit of interstitial fluid in a thing called a lacuna. Those are the other two commonalities. As far as the rest, right, bone is going to be a really hard mineralized matrix. That is calcium, phosphate, and stuff that you know from what bone feels like. It's largely inorganic, right? That's why we can have skeletons that last for millions of years. Whereas cartilage is more like a watery matrix, although it does have, obviously it's not like, loose connective tissue or dense connective tissue or anything. It has structure, right? It's more like a rubber, sort of rubbery, watery material. right? The matrix around it, right? And so in the videos, I talk a little bit about the breakdown, not so much of the cartilage, but of the bone matrix and, you know, the differences between organic and inorganic and stuff. But for right now, let's just walk through some of the other features, right? And general picture of where you might find cartilages and the structure of bone and stuff, right? So for cartilage, histology wise, you only just have to recognize cartilage is cartilage, this hyaline cartilage here, but it's broken down into 3 parts. The most common one is this cartilage called hyaline cartilage. Okay. That is what is at the tips of your bones, at the tips of your joint surfaces, where the bones would be rubbing together in synovial joints. They'd also be forming this connection in between your ribs and your sternum over here. And they would also be making up your windpipe over here, your trachea, as well as some of your bronchi, right? So in all cases, well, in the case of your what's called articular cartilage, where bones are meeting together, they provide a nice, smooth, slippery surface. A nice, smooth, slippery surface, right? Whereas these over here, as well as your, well, let's see, over here, instead of bone connecting bone, right, from the rib cage all the way here, this gives a little bit of flexibility for your rib cage right here to expand in and out, right? Because bone is a little bit more brittle than cartilage, right? So it's strong, but it's also a little bit flexible. Same thing over here for your trachea, right? It's made up of these various tissues, but it's got these cartilage rings going down the side right here, which is going to hold it open like a PVC pipe, right? Because this windpipe has got to be kept open. It's not like air is going to force it open like your esophagus, right? So it's given it a strong, right? It's given it structure. There's not a lot of pressure on it or anything like that. So it doesn't need to be really hard bone, but it does need to be like rigid enough so that it holds it open right there. Right, so that's hyaline cartilage in a couple of places. And for your articular cartilage, again, it has a very smooth, slippery surface for when these bones are moving up against each other. All right, so that's your blue hyaline cartilage. There's a couple other specialized cartilages that basically you're going to take that hyaline cartilage, you're going to add a whole bunch of cartilage, collagen fibers, and you're going to come up with fibrocartilage. And that's kind of a mixture between dense, regular connective tissue forming tendons and ligaments and cartilage, right? So you'll notice these red spots, right, going down the spinal cord, the vertebral column, as well as in between your 2 hip bones right here, and supporting on the, you know, in between your femur and your tibia over here, right? You have these kind of pads or connections that are acting like shock pads, right? So instead of vertebrae crushing up against together, you got these called intervertebral discs made of this fibrocartilage, kind of like shock pads, right? And, you know, they're all in the center of the gravity of your body, right? Where the weight of your body is, and especially down on your knees right here, you got these fibrocartilage pad called the menisci, right? Which is going to act as a shock absorber, right? And by adding collagen, you give it a little bit of resistance against twisting and shearing pressures, because cartilage otherwise isn't so great at withstanding shearing, torsion sort of pressure. It's very good at, you know, facing compressional pressure, not so good at that. When you add a bunch of fibers, it's kind of giving it an extra toughness, right? So that's your fibrocartilage. Then in a couple of very discrete locations, you have what's called elastic cartilage. You take hyaline cartilage, you add a bunch of elastic fibers. All you got to do if you want to see the texture of this is you take your ear, you fold it up against your, you know, fold it in on itself, and it'll bounce right back, right? That's elastic cartilage. Your ear, you know, it has structure. All right, here's what you do. You feel your lobe of your ear. That's connective. That's kind of dense, regular, irregular connective tissue, the fleshy part. And then you move up, you could feel the actual cartilage part. That would be your elastic cartilage. And you could feel how the sort of texture of it is by just kind of bouncing it back and forth. Your epiglottis, that's covering your windpipe when you're swallowing food is also made of that, right? It's a little flap that'll flap down and pop right back up. So that's your elastic cartilage. The only thing you'll have to identify histologically is the hyaline cartilage, right? But these are just two other types where they are, some of the properties. Again, take hyaline, add collagen, you get fibrocartilage. Take hyaline, add elastic cartilage, you got elastic cartilage. All right, so that's it for cartilage. I'll actually talk a little bit more about it when we talk about some of the structures of bone and contrast them. But we're going to get to the actual bone tissue. And first we want to look at the anatomy of a long bone, gross anatomy, looking at sort of the structures of it, right? They have particular names for these particular regions, and they have this kind of similar, they have a stereotypical structure to them. So a bone is an organ, right? This is your humerus, and it is an individual organ, right? It's made up of bone tissue, but it's also got blood vessels, it's got cartilage, it's got nerves and everything like that. So the structure of any of these organs, you'll have named regions at the proximal and distal end called the epiphysis. That's where they'll form with other joints. And then you have the shaft going down the middle right there. In between them, you'll have something called the metaphysis. That will be important when we talk about the growth of a bone, right? But otherwise, you got the ends called the epiphysis, which will have the cartilage on top, and you'll have the shaft. Within the shaft, right over here, you have this big cavity, this big open space right over here called the medullary cavity. Right, the medullary cavity that goes down the middle. It's basically a hollow space on the inside of your bone. As far as the bone tissue itself, you have two different kind of types, right? You have a compact bone surrounding the outside of a certain type of organization. And then you have the spongy bone on the inside right here. Spongy bone. And as we'll see, they're similar material, it's just they're organized differently. All right. And then within this spongy bone though, right, as well as in the medullary cavity right here, you have what's called bone marrow, which is a specialized type of connective tissue. That's basically where all your new blood cells are formed, right? So that's made up here in the spongy bone and then down in the medullary cavity here. Right. Well, actually in adults, this bone marrow will be yellow bone marrow. It's just mineral storage. Now that's the gross anatomy. Epiphysis, diaphysis, medullary cavity. Spongy bone on the inside, compact bone on the outside. So for that compact bone, sometimes called cortical bone, right? It's always going to be, it's that smooth layer, right? If this was an English muffin, the compact bone would be that outside part, and then that nooks and crannies and porous inside would be the spongy bone, right? With all these holes in there. All right, so this makes sense. If you think this is the part that would be exposed close to the environment, it's much harder, it's much denser, it's much more protective against any kind of blunt trauma, right? Whereas the spongy bone, which is very lightweight, more delicate, is going to be on the inside, right? And that'll be true, you know, whether you're looking at a very thin layer of compact bone, like in your skull, or in your limb bones, right, which you're going to have a really thick layer where all the weight is on, right, where all the pressure's on. Right, so your spongy bone, what that does, right, is because of all these pores, right, there's a lot of air in there, or space in there rather, right, that's going to make this whole thing much more lightweight than if it was all compact bone. Right, so the compact bone is this protective outside, and so it isn't too heavy. You got all this spongy bone, which is strong because of the way it's organized, but it's also lightweight. Right, compact bone, spongy bone. All right, everybody clear on that? And we'll talk about the structure of these two types of bones right there. So if I ask you how many types of bone tissue there are, or if I say identify this bone, be specific, you'll either say compact or spongy bone. All right. So bone, as opposed to, say, the connective tissue you looked at, is going to be very distinct, right? It's going to be much more kind of easy to conceptualize as far as the histology goes, because it has a very specific kind of highly organized tissue structure here. Right, so we're going to look at, these different, all these different kind of features over here, inside and outside, and look at the overall picture. Right, so again, this is just showing you the complexity, right, of any particular bone right here. So we're going to start right on the outside over here, the covering of the bone, right? And this is ossia, remember, osseous tissue, and peri means surrounding. So what we have right here is the periosteum. Peri, surrounding, osteum, meaning bone, right? Cartilage also has, as you'll see in the video, also has perichondrium surrounding it. But this periosteum over here is like dense, irregular connective tissue that surrounds the outside. It's kind of like the skin of the bone itself, right? And since, it's the bone is on the inside of your body, you don't need an epithelial lining. You could do with this connective tissue. And it's doing what connective tissue does, which is provide a route for all these blood vessels that are coming inside the blood vessels. And it also is going to, form this attachment points for tendons and ligaments. Remember we talked about that dense, regular connective tissue? It was, all the collagen fibers were coming down here. And those collagen fibers are embedding into the periosteum over here, right? And even some of the collagen fibers are embedding in here. All right, so this periosteum is the covering of the bone right there. Periosteum on the outside of the bone. It's going to be dense, irregular, because it needs to be a little bit protective on the outside of the bone right there. All right, so that's the outside. And then you want to look at the compact versus the spongy bone organization. Again, compact bone here in blue. This is an electron micrograph. Over here, we're versus this very porous kind of structure of the spongy bone. So even though these look very different, right? You could think of a big metal wall or something like that. You could take that same metal, form these like struts or like a jungle gym or something, right? And form it this way, same material, different kind of organization, right? So it's the same way with compact and spongy bone. They have the same matrix, they have the same bone cells. They're just organized different, right? And the location is spongy bone on the inside, compact bone on the outside. So when we look at that spongy bone, like all these struts and spaces and stuff, I mentioned the periosteum on the outside of the bone. You also have another layer called the endosteum, inside, osteum meaning bone. And instead of the periosteum, which is going to have that fibrous layer surrounding it like this, it'll also have a cellular layer. But for your endosteum, all it has is a bunch of these blue cells of different types, mostly osteoblasts, which we'll talk about in a little bit, as well as osteoclasts, right? So there's no fibrous connective tissue on the inside. You don't need it there for protection or anything. You just got this cellular lining surrounding these struts and spongy bone, as well as in this structure here, which we'll see is the central canal, right? And so here's the periosteum, that fibrous layer on the outside, and then you might have some endosteum on the inside, right? So that is just the coverings, and now we get to the bone cells and bone matrix, right? Well, we won't talk too much about the matrix, but we'll talk about the structure of it all, right? So we want to talk a little bit about these two types of, a couple of different types of cells right here, right? Which are going to be these osteocytes, right? That we see right here. They're going to make up the mature cells. And we're also going to be talking about these osteoblasts. They're actually going to make the matrix right here, right? And what's the matrix? And then we're also going to see what these structures right here are, these canaliculi. And everything we talk about here, again, compact bone, spongy bone is going to be similar. we didn't note this before, but if you watch the lecture videos, that the cartilage, remember, is avascular, right? There's no blood vessels going through it. It's highly inert. It's kind of one of the more substances where you can replace it with an artificial, man-made objects, and it'll serve the same function. With bone is very dynamic tissue, actually, right? Despite the fact that, all you see is like dinosaur bones and all that stuff that's been dead, while it's living, really, really highly active tissue. And it responds to stress, it remodels itself, it does all this stuff, right? And to do that, these highly active cells need a big blood supply, right? So you got all these bloods coming, all these blood vessels penetrating into the bone, running perpendicular to the long axis or running longitudinal to the long axis. Right, so there's heavy blood supply, plus there's a lot of blood vessels going through your spongy bone as well, right? So bone is heavily vascularized, right? That's an important point in both, how it's dynamic, how it responds to stresses, how it repairs itself, unlike cartilage, as well as tendons and stuff, right, which don't repair themselves very well. All right, so the next part is the cell types of it. And I'm talking about these 3 cell types. Your mature bone cells that we'll see all around over here, for the most part, are these osteocytes. Right? And they're maintaining the matrix. They're also going to kind of sense what's going on in the bone and like direct other parts of the bone to change and everything like that. So there are these osteocytes sitting all around here, right, within the mineralized matrix, and we'll see how they survive there. And then you have these osteoblasts, these immature cells. They will go on to form osteoblasts once they're mature, but while they're osteoblasts, just like fibroblasts, they were making the matrix, right? They were secreting the bone matrix. That is the part of the matrix that's organic, that will kind of give a framework for that calcium and phosphate minerals to kind of crystallize. Right, so these are the bone makers, osteoblasts. And these are constantly making new bone because you have these other types of cells which aren't related to these. They come in and they reabsorb bone, right? They start secreting these digestive enzymes which break down and reabsorb calcium. So these are constantly breaking down your bone, these osteoclasts. So bone makers, bone breakers. And these will be big important when we're talking about bone remodeling as well as aging and stuff, right? These bone makers. So bone is highly dynamic tissue, and you got these 3 cell types. Unlike your fibroblast stuff, we only had that 1 cell type that we were cared about. All right, so here are some of these. This is an electron micrograph of these osteocytes, right? And they're sitting in these little spaces over here. And then they have these little extensions, these little arms, these little protoplasmic extensions coming off their cell membrane, right? And so these are living cells. They're highly dynamic, but yet they're sitting in this mineralized matrix, right? This is a key point here, because we'll get back to it. And we will get back to it. But first, let's talk about the overall organization of the bone right here, right? So what we were looking at back over here, right? These osteocytes sitting over here, and these, right? If you look really closely, these are all those osteocytes, and these little tentacle things are those things. And we'll talk more about what they are. But for this compact bone made up by a whole bunch of these units, this functional unit of bone called the osteon, compact bone called the osteon, right? So all these little bullseyes in here that are running down the length of the bone, right, longitudinally right here, are called the osteon, right? And the osteon, in the middle of the osteon, right, so this over here is an osteon, right? And this is one that's kind of pulled out to show the different layers, right? Each osteon is made up of, in like this case, 1, 2, 3 layers called concentric lamella, right? Lamella means layers, right? They're concentric layers. So you got these 3 or 4 layers forming these osteons, like these rings, like a tree ring, right? And they're running all the way down, these big kind of rods running longitudinally that are providing like densely packed beams right here that are providing the rigidity and strength of the bone right here. Right, so they're made up of several concentric lamellae. Within, around each ring of the lamellae, you have the osteocytes sitting in their little lacuna in each ring doing whatever they do, right? And then in the center of that osteocyte, over here, you have what's called the central canal, right? And that's why these blood vessels are running up longitudinally, right? They come in through here, through what's called the perforating canals, like going perpendicular to the bone, to the longitudinal side of the bone, and then those blood vessels are running up and down, right? So you got these blood vessels, right, running through the central canal in the middle of the osteon. So these are the osteons. These are considered the functional unit. And the other thing we'll see here is that for each of these rings, there's not only mineralized matrix, but there's collagen in there. And the collagen fibers are going to be running in one direction in one lamella, and they're going to be running in the other direction in the other lamellas. So what this does is provide like protection and kind of resistance against any kind of twisting and torsion that may occur in the bone, right? These collagen fibers in there. Right, so you got these rods, right, going through here. They're very strong because they're mineralized matrix. They're also, providing resistance against tensile forces. So those are your osteons. You also have going around the entire bone right over here, going around the whole circumference. These circumferential lamellae, right, going around the whole outside right here. And then you have a couple of these are artifacts of the development of bone in here, these interstitial, in between the osteons, interstitial lamellae. So let's get back, let's go to look at that osteocyte and lacuna, and then we're going to compare and contrast to our chondrocyte and lacuna. What I say about chondrocyte was that they were avascular, right? And if we looked a little bit more at the structure, we'd see it's the cartilage, chunk of cartilage was going to be surrounded by pericardium, which had blood vessels and stuff like that, which could bring this avascular tissue oxygen and stuff. Or if it was in a joint cavity, you'd have like what's called synovial fluid, which we'll talk about, which will bring it oxygen and stuff. So because this is a watery matrix, you can have like oxygen, glucose, right? You can have it diffusing through this, right, until it gets to these lacuna, and then these cells could take it up right here. So you do have this diffusion through this because it is pretty much a watery kind of matrix, right? And that's the little lacuna has a slightly different, it's a little bit of a more liquid structure that the cells are actually sitting in this little space. Otherwise, that hard rubbery matrix, but you still could get glucose and oxygen. These cells are adapted to low oxygen levels, so you don't need much, but this is enough to allow them to live and do what they do. So that's your avascular cartilage tissue. With your bone tissue, you got this mineralized matrix, right? And oxygen, glucose cannot diffuse through this stuff over here, right? But I said this cell, this osteocyte, needs a lot of oxygen. It needs a lot of glucose. They're actually very active cells. They're doing a lot of stuff. And so instead of stuff diffusing through the matrix, right, you have it sitting in this little lacuna here, but then you also have these little holes, these little canals going through the matrix. Right? You can see these over here, right? And through those little canals, that's going to be like a fluid-filled space that's continuous with these lacunas. And so the cell is sitting in here and it extends its arms out through these canals. And so what it's doing there is going to oxygen and glucose source, and oxygen and fluid and stuff can flow into this area right here. So these canaliculi are kind of a way for the nearby blood vessels and stuff to get nutrients and oxygen through, because these canals will connect to that tissue that does have blood vessels in it, right? Because stuff can't diffuse through this matrix. And then the other thing these canaliculi do, little canals, is connect one lacuna with another lacuna. Right? And in that sense, all the osteocytes are kind of communicating with each other, and that'll be important again when we talk about remodeling, bone remodeling and stuff. All right, so everybody get the idea what these lacuna and these canaliculi are. The canaliculi are little passageways through the mineralized matrix. All right, there. Passageways through bony matrix, right? Lacuna, the chondrocytes, the cartilage don't need that because stuff can diffuse right through it. The little arms, these protoplasmic extensions are going through the canaliculi. All right. So that's your compact bone. Right? And the osteon was the functional kind of unit of the compact bone. And then you have on the inside of your bone, remember you had that porous or cancellous or spongy bone, right? But when you look at it closely, if you take a cross section of one of these, what are called trabecula over here, right, you'd see that you have the osteocytes in the lacuna. You'd have the little caniculi, that are these little lines right here. And in this case, you could see, here's the osteocytes. Maybe get a better sense. All these caniculi, they can connect with each other, and they could also connect to the outside over here where there's going to be a lot of blood vessels and stuff like that. And then that could get through the caniculi to the cells. In the case of the osteon, the osteocytes and the osteon, the caniculi can reach over here to this blood supply over here or to the outside bone part. They're going to be connected to some kind of blood source where they can get the blood filtrate. All right, but the osteon, the functional unit here with these rods going up and down here, here they have these struts over here called the trabecula, over here making up the spongy bone. But otherwise, same stuff, right? Osteocytes and lacuna, canaliculi, right? Even these little lamellae over here. All right, so I think that does it. I want to point out while we're here, and we'll get back to this, but here's the osteocytes, right? They're connecting with each other through these canaliculi, and those canaliculi had some kind of interstitial fluid that's floating the cells and running and kind of traveling through them. When your bone is facing some kind of mechanical load in one way or another, right, that's going to cause the fluid to run in a particular kind of direction, right, based on that movement. And the osteocytes, I said they're dynamic, right? They're detecting that movement over here. And so they can kind of get an idea of what your normal everyday stress is, and they could respond, right? They're going to be, this is the way they actually detect this movement and stress and everything, and then direct the bone to kind of make your bone stronger over here, or say, hey, there's nothing going on, eat it away, right? So that's what these osteocytes are kind of, how they're so active in here, right? Because they're kind of getting a sense of the fluid flow within here. All right, so that's the brief picture. Again, you want to watch the lecture, the actual videos on it. I go into a little more detail about some of the bigger picture of some of the cartilage and bone tissue organization. And we'll go back to his dreaded histology guide. We're going to look at chapter 5, cartilage and bone for all this. And we're just going to look at a couple of samples of the cartilage, right, which will be MH046 and MH136, right? And again, you don't have to know that it's the trachea, right, or anything like that. We're just going to kind of look at the structure, right? So cartilage isn't, an organ in itself. It's just a piece of tissue giving a particular tissue structure, right? So your trachea is your windpipe. So you got these rings of cartilage pads going through them, giving it structure, right? And in this case, it's a longitudinal section. This is a cross section. But you can see, these are like the cross section of the ring, and they stand out amongst the other types of tissues here. So because it's your trachea, it's going to be lined with pseudostratified. You don't have to know this, but you will someday. Pseudostratified, ciliated columnar epithelia. You have connective tissue, maybe some muscle, other sorts of glandular tissue, and then you come to the cartilage tissue itself. Right? And then in this case, these are the cells, these are the lacuna, these are the cells within the lacuna, right? So the chondrocytes, and then the big space. So if I ask you what the cells are, you say chondrocytes. If I ask you what the space is, you say lacuna. And I'm not asking you about the chondroblasts, but they would be out here, right? In the perichondrium, right? That's the fibrous layer directly surrounding the cartilage pad right there. Again, the perichondrium acts as kind of like a girdle to help things from squishing out. It also is going to have all the blood vessels and stuff that supply the nutrients. All right, so that's one picture of hyaline cartilage. And the other one, it's on the bone. It's actually on the developing bone, which we'll also use for the bone, right? So this is a developing bone. And as we see, when you start out as an embryo and fetus, you start out with this cartilage model that's slowly replaced by bone as you develop, right? And then this is what's left over in the end is your articular cartilage on the ends of bones. And then when you're growing, like when you're an adolescent and everything, you got this growth plate over here. But all that is hyaline cartilage. You'll learn about the particulars a little later, but you can recognize the difference between this hyaline cartilage over here, and then this is the bone tissue, right, over here. And articular cartilage, the one that's within a joint cavity, as we'll see, doesn't have a perichondrium around it, but the outside of the bone will. Right, so, you won't see any perichondrium, I'm sorry. You won't see any perichondrium here. This is really all periosteum on the outside. But you could tell the difference between the cartilage tissue and then the bone tissue down over here, right? Just, if nothing else, by the staining, right? But you'd also notice that within the bone, right, here's the little cells in the lacuna, here's all those blood vessels, right? When you get down to the cartilage, it's completely avascular, no blood vessels going through. So those are just a couple of pictures. And then that picture, this one that says EM147, that's the electron microscopy site. That's the one I was showing in the lecture videos. And these are all those pictures from the EM ones I've already shown right there, but that's the cartilage. Chondrocytes, the chondrocytes in lacuna. What's the tissue? Hyaline cartilage. What's the cells? Chondrocytes. What's that structure or space? That is a lacuna. And the same will be true while we're here, for the chondrocytes, whatever the other one I was showing there, as well as the compact and spongy bone. All right, back to this. Let's go down Over here, we had a couple of different stainings of bones. This is what's called ground or burnt bone. Over here, it's a really simple, I shouldn't say simple, but it's very easy to identify all these different structures. So 044 is this ground. This is the medullary cavity over here. So this is a cross section of a bone. And remember I said these perforating canals, these would be running perpendicular, right? Whereas these are the blood vessels that are running through it. And then as you get closer in, what you're looking at here, these are like those central canals. These are the ones that are running longitudinally, those blood vessels, right? So this is a perforating canal, and then this one's running longitudinally, right? You're looking at different aspects of them. And then everything around those central canals are going to be the osteocytes, if they were there, in the lacuna, right? And that's pretty much all the structures you could see for this particular M044. And the other ones, these two are pretty much the same in that they give really nice detail. All the organic tissue has been burnt out, and it's been, all the spaces are kind of evident. So for this, you know, you're looking at what looks like kind of like tree ring stuff. So this whole big ring, this is the central canal that you got going on, and then the concentric lamellae surrounding it. And then within the concentric lamellae, you have these oval kind of spaces. That's the cells. There's no cells because they've been burnt out, but that's the lacuna where the osteocytes would be. Okay. And then coming off those lacuna, all these squiggly lines over here are the canaliculi. Right, the canaliculi. Those are those little canals, right, where the, right, here's the osteocyte. Osteocyte over here, it has its extensions going through these little caniculi. And if you notice, like they're all kind of reaching for this blood source over here. They're kind of a little more directed this way for these little canals. So in all these pictures, right, this is a jellyfish, right? That's the body. The tentacles are the canaliculi, the squiggly lines there. Right, so that's this tissue. And the other one is almost exactly the same. It's just a slightly different color. Right, except that maybe the osteons come out even a little bit clearer right there. Right, all these rings, central canal. Over here, these are the osteo, the lacuna, and then you can make out all the little canaliculi here. Like what I meant was on MS44, that's where you could really see the perforating canal and the medullary cavity right over there, right? I should have wrote perforating, like maybe this isn't clear, but right on this slice, you could see these structures. On the rest of them, these other two ones. And then we have the developing bone in which we could see these structures here, lacuna, osteocytes, periosteum, spongy bone, trabecula. So that was the one we looked on the cartilage for already. But it has another one with maybe different stuff labeled. Again, this is looking at the actual development, as we'll see, right? You start off with this cartilage model that's going to be gradually replaced by bone. You can see the process actually happening. Oh, this is the old cartilage and bone is replacing it. But what's being replaced on the inside here, this is all the spongy bone, the trabecula of the spongy bone that you can see here and here. Oops. And when you zoom in, right, we could see the osteocytes in the lacuna. Right? Since it's a cross section, you can't really see those osteons and rings and stuff like that, but you can see the trabecula. That's basically these, you know, these struts and everything here. right? And then you could also see, as I mentioned before, yeah.
So you're saying the trabecula is like the darker lines that I was seeing, like the darker, they look
Every,
kind of
just all like, so, you know, this on the outside over here would be the more like the compact bone, but all this stuff, all these are, you know, these are the pores. So all these are trabecula.
Oh, that makes sense because
The,
they're
the
okay.
purple stuff is like the last bit of cartilage stuff that's being replaced. And we'll kind of talk about what that is. This is left over. And then over here, oops, you know, that this will be like the epiphysis where all the spongy bone is going to be. So these are like the forming trabecula over here.
Okay, that
So
makes sense.
you can also, some of these have the links so you can actually click on them and see them. But anytime you see these pores and stuff like that, you could figure the stuff that's surrounding them are going to be the
Trabecula.
trabecula. So that's a couple of those. And then this last one over here for, this is your spinal cord. Right over here, this is your nervous system, but it's surrounded by the vertebrae. Over here, right, these are all your meat of the back muscle, you know, your muscle, back muscles over here. And this is the body of your vertebrae over here. So this is a mature bone, and you can see these trabecula over here, much clearer. Right? Those are the osteocytes in the lacuna. And then these like struts and everything are the actual trabecula. And the other thing you'd see here, right, surrounding the bone, like any bone, you got the periosteum on the outside over here. And then remember I said your spongy bone was where your bone cells are made. This is all these black spaces in here. All this stuff in here is your bone marrow, the red bone marrow where your new blood cells are being made. I think I have bone marrow over here. Right, so that's that slice right there. All right, and that's all you got to know for these. They're pretty distinctive, unlike that mess of like collagen fibers you see in the other stuff. All right, so just kind of take a little bit of look at those. That's it for the histology portion.